Hello and welcome to Keen Reads. My name is Jared. Today I'm going to be going through 6 books that I found difficult to read my first time through. Actually, my only time through for all of these other than one of them, which we'll talk about. And I'm going to be talking about what made them difficult for me personally, and maybe a takeaway that I have to take forward with my future readings, keeping in mind now that I've made it through that book. Let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is kind of a cheat, because the time that I actually read it all the way through, I did not find it difficult at all. In fact, I sailed through it, and that is Moby Dick. I don't like this edition of Moby Dick. I don't really like the Signet Classics, or really mass market paperbacks in general. I'm trying to go through and replace most of my books with trade paperbacks, but this one has a special place in my heart because it's the first time, and so far the only time I've read Moby Dick, was in this volume. What I found difficult about this novel, I think, was that I just tried to read it at a time when it wasn't right for me. And that's kind of my takeaway for this, for Moby Dick, is that sometimes there's a right time in your life to read a book, and there's a wrong time. And not necessarily saying you need to read it at a very specific time period, but there might be times when you're not ready for a book. And the first time I tried to read this, I was still an undergrad, studying pharmacy. Well, I guess at that time I was basically a chemistry/biology major, but kind of occupied my mind with other things that were non-literature, and when I tried to read this, I just was not getting it. I got maybe 50 pages into it and gave up because I just was not interested in it. I could not get into the prose, and I really just wasn't ready for it. Fast forward a couple years, I was in pharmacy school at the time, still studying pharmacy at this point, but had cultivated my reading chops a little bit more, and ended up giving this another try and just loved it. Fell in love with it, sailed right through it. No pun intended. Actually, maybe a pun intended, because I did think about that a little ahead of time. I was like, I'm going to drop that. So for Moby Dick, I'm just going to say that sometimes you may not be ready for a book, but that doesn't mean that the book's not for you. It may just mean you need to try it again in the future. Next book I will talk about, and I say books because one of these is not a book, or one of these is not a novel. Let me push these out of the frame so you don't get a little sneak peek of what's coming up in the video. So the next one is War and Peace, which might not be a novel depending on how you talk about it. I'm pretty sure Tolstoy actually did not define it as a novel, more of like an epic or a history or something like that. I don't know. I know he said it wasn't a novel. Surprisingly, it wasn't the length of this book that got me, even though it's probably the longest. Actually, it's not the longest book I've ever read. The longest book I've ever read is coming up. But what got me was the names. And this is a issue, not really an issue, a struggle that I have with a lot of Russian novels, in that the names are often given in different, patients have, or not patients. Again, I'm a pharmacist, so I am prone to calling people patients, but the characters can have multiple names or derivatives of the same name, and they might have different names to different people, or they might be called by their title, and because of that, it was really hard for me to keep things straight. So my takeaway for this novel is don't be afraid, and maybe you're not afraid, but maybe you just don't want to put in the extra work, but sometimes it does require looking at extra resources to understand a book and to really get the most out of it. So I ended up referring online to various character charts and naming guidelines throughout this book so that I could remember who was talking and who was who and what was going on. So don't be afraid to put in a little extra work. You'll reap benefits in your reading by doing so, because you'll just get more out of what you read, specifically when it comes to books like War and Peace, where it's very important to know who's talking and the relationship between characters. Tolstoy writes very relational novels or books, and that's very important to know who's who. And there's also like 1,000 characters in this, so not saying that I looked up 1,000 characters, but I think you get the gist. Next book we will talk about is, I'm not going in any particular order, Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. So you'll notice a trend that Other than Moby Dick, all of these are very long books, and some people might say Moby Dick's very long as well. It's a long book. But again, it wasn't necessarily the length that got to me about this book. It was the difficulty in the prose. There were certain points where I just did not understand what Pynchon was talking about. I could not tell you what it was happening, who was speaking, what they were talking about, or what Pynchon was talking about. And about halfway through this book, I kind of sat down and was like, what am I getting out of this? And then I managed to go back and reread some of the tabs that I had tabbed from the book, and realized that what I was getting was just some beautiful prose and some beautiful descriptions, and altogether just a good reading experience, even if I couldn't understand what was going on. So as soon as I kind of let myself take a step back and be okay with the fact that I'm not picking up everything that Pynchon is laying down here, I'm not 100% tracking, and that's okay, because there's still other things to be gained from a book. So I'm just going to read one passage that I had bookmarked. I did not pick this ahead of time, but here we go. So, in the strong twilight over the mountains of Wales, draining of light, league upon league of darkly forested peaks, to the eye familiar, the occasional interruption of a cabin or plantation, chimney smoke, a gray patch of girdled trees amid the green pervading, a shade ascending, one hollow at a time. The wind acquires at the dark a potency it did not possess in the light. An axe bit's blow quenched in the living wood, a dog after a squirrel, a percussion sandwich of hammer, anvil, and the work between. Night over all this watershed, how vast, that covers each sound in it like a breathing mouth, humid, warm, carrying the odors of living and dying, that takes back everything committed upon the land that day, without appeal, dissolving all in shadow. Yeah, I'm glad I read that one, because that was a really beautiful passage. So sometimes it's okay to not understand everything that's going on, but just sit back and take in what you're reading at face value, because you're bound to find things that are beautiful. Next, we'll talk about Under the Volcano. Under the Volcano was a book that a lot of people had recommended to me, and I came in with very high expectations, and I just found it very difficult in a similar way to Mason and Dixon, in that I had difficulty following what Malcolm Lowry was talking about. And my takeaway from this book is to pay attention to symbols and settings and themes and things like that, because it can really enrich your reading experience when you're not 100% picking up what he's putting down. So with Mason and Dixon, my focus was a lot more on the prose itself and getting just joy out of the prose, whereas with Under the Volcano, I really paid attention to the symbols and the settings. This is a very symbolic book. There's a lot going on with drinking, volcanoes, obviously from the title, Volcanoes. But drinking is a major theme in this book, and the kind of disillusionment and confusion that it can cause. And I felt like once I started paying more attention to the symbols and when things were recurring, the settings that were recurring, I did get a lot more out of this book. But another thing to take away from this book is that there is a need to reread. So similar to Moby Dick, this is a book that's very high on my list of rereads. I plan to reread this within the next couple years, probably, because I really feel like this was another book similar to Moby Dick where I just read it at the wrong time. Two more here, and we have, this one's kind of another cheat because it's 3 novels. So this is Beckett's trilogy. I'm not including How It Is in this. How It Is just included in this volume. But this is Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. Specifically, what I'm talking about is The Unnameable. So, I actually really loved Malloy, and Malone Dies was okay. But Beckett's theme here is kind of deconstruction and absurdism. And as you progress through these 3 novels, they get more sparse. There's less description, there's less words. There's less points of view. It's almost just statements of, not even of what's happening, just statements, I would say. And it gets extremely difficult. And my takeaway from this one is that sometimes you need to read very slowly. So I blew through Malloy because I loved it. Malone Dies took a little bit longer. But really, the Unnameable took me a long time to read, even though none of these in and of themselves are long novels, just because I really needed to slow down and think about what I was reading. And again, with Beckett's prose, sometimes what is there on the page is what is there and what is meant. There's nothing deeper to it. But I found that if I tried to just blow through this book very fast, I don't think I would have finished it. I think it was important for me to read this slowly and read this in between other books in order to really feel like I was getting something out of it. So sometimes it's important to read slowly. The last book that I have is The Anatomy of Melancholy. So this is by Robert Burton. This was not super difficult to read, honestly. This one is almost purely difficult because of how long it was. And my takeaway from this one is that not all books are meant to be read front to back, all the way through in one sitting. So with this book, it's almost a textbook or a medical textbook on exactly what it sounds like, The Anatomy of Melancholy. I've talked about this book before, but this book was extremely difficult for me because of the length. I tried to read this straight through without having any other books to read alongside of it, just dipping in this book every single day, and I would not recommend that. I ended up, I guess, being successful in that I did read this through 100% without stopping. But looking back on it and the way that I use this book now is it's much more useful, I think, for dipping in and out of. There's certain things that I've marked, and really opening up to any random page in here is going to get you something great to read, I think. And I guess my takeaway from this is that just some books are meant for dipping in and out of. Other things like this would be like art books, poetry anthologies, Montaigne's essays. Some books you don't have to read front to back. And even though I did read this one front to back, I think I would have done better to really have dipped in and out of it, rather than forcing myself to read this front to back over the course of 2 months. I think it was an unproductive 2 months in my reading life. So those are 6 books that I found difficult, the reason that I found them difficult, and some takeaways that I have from them. I hope you found this useful. Let me know if you struggled with any of these books as well, or any other books that you have struggled with in the comments, or any tips that you have for other readers of how to get through some more difficult books. Thanks for watching.